and welcome to Fashion Talks at the American University of Paris, to the 2021-22 series entitled Between Consumption, Criticism and Activism. This year's edition is concerned with the different and contradictory roles that we all play in relation to fashion and the fashion industry. And after having explored different forms of activism, we focus on fashion criticism today. Ever since the recording of the printed word, there have been traditions of criticizing fashion. So, for example, Christine de Pizon's fashion critique dates back already to 1405, when she compared the followers of fashion to sheep in a way that they followed the herd, much like many men who've critiqued fashion throughout the 19th century especially. So the work of our guest today, Francesca Granata, is therefore highly pertinent as the editor of Fashion Criticism and Anthology that was published this year to much acclaim. So we're very happy to welcome you, Francesca, today to AUP. Please give a warm a welcome as digitally possible to Francesca, who joined us from New York City this evening. Hello. Thank you. So Francesca Granata is Associate Professor of Fashion Studies in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons School of Design. And her research centers on modern and contemporary visual and material culture with a particular focus on fashion history and theory, gender and performance studies. She's the editor and founder of the journal Fashion Projects. And previously, she published the monograph Experimental Fashion Performance Art Carnival and the Grotesque Body. And this year, she published Fashion Criticism and Anthology. So very warm welcome and over to you, Francesca.
Thank you so much to Sophie and Renata for inviting me to this presentation, to give this presentation on my book. I regrettably cannot be in Paris in person, but I really look forward to get your feedback and any question after my presentation. I will bear with me while I share my screen. Here you go.
Works.
Hopefully you can all see it.
Yes,
okay?
Thank you. It works.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you.
Now let's see if I can advance it. So this anthology on fashion criticism, so this is really the previous slide, started as a re-evaluation. It's meant as a re-evaluation of fashion criticism, plain and simple. So the book started with a question. And the question is, how is such a rich and diverse area of criticism remain so understudied and undervalued? This question has been percolating with me for quite some time. For instance, these slides show a cover of a journal titled Fashion Project, which I started in 2005 here in New York with the mission of highlighting the importance of fashion within current critical discourses. And the same impetus that led me to start a journal led me to work on its fourth issue, which was an investigation of fashion criticism as articulated in journalistic writing. So the issue is structured around interview with fashion critics about the state of their field. And our subject included Judith Thurman, a staff writer from at the New Yorker, people at the Times, Susie Menkes, you saw her, a drawing of her on the cover, which was done at the International Herald Tribune, as well as people like Robin Givan, at the Washington Post, Mariuccia Casadio at the art and fashion critic then at Vogue Italia, as well as Stefano Tonchi, who perhaps is better known as an editor, but among other things, it was a fashion writer in 1980s Italy, started a small niche fashion magazine in the 80s with Maria Luisa Frisa called West Stuff. And there were many others, I'm just mentioning a few. And the richness of the interview and the discussion it generated, this issue in the press, which was quite unique for this kind of very small publication, led me to start working on the anthology and solidified for me the fact, not only the importance of the topic, but the fact that it was still at that point in 2013 under-researched. So as I was saying, the central question that animate my investigation are questions really. Why has fashion criticism remained undervalued relative to other areas of cultural criticism? What has been its historical development vis-a-vis other fields of criticism? And whether its delay in legitimization is tied to its gender specificity. So, by the fact that historically it has been written by and for women. We could argue that fashion criticism is still undergoing the kind of process of legitimization that other realms of popular cultural criticism underwent in the 60s and 70s, when barriers between high and low culture became to really be taken down. Among these fields of popular culture criticism that developed in this period are, of course, film criticism, as well as popular music criticism. So underscoring this delay in legitimization is really the institutional also consideration of fashion criticism. Here in the US, for instance, the Pulitzer Prize, which award prizes in criticism, each year only gave one prize in fashion criticism to Robin Givhan at the Washington Post in 2006. And interestingly, the board said that she was able to transform fashion criticism into cultural criticism, thus almost implying that normally fashion itself and its criticism reside outside of culture. So I thought that the wording was interesting. She was almost given the award in spite of writing about fashion. Also, another notable omission is the fact that the Library of America, which is really tasked with the mission of championing the US cultural heritage by publishing America's greatest writing, published anthologies of really almost any form of criticism you can think of, food, rock criticism, certainly architecture, art, but it's never published an anthology on fashion to date. And so that's why I started to think that this anthology was needed. Despite, however, its lower status vis-a-vis other forms of cultural criticism, fashion criticism has its own distinctive history. And both in the book and in this presentation, I will focus on this history primarily in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK. Fashion was covered from its inception in the New Yorker. So from 1925, when the New Yorker magazine was founded by Lois Long, who upon her death in 1974 was credited by the then famed editor William Shawn for inventing the field. And here you see a New Yorker cover and one of Long's column called Feminine Fashions. She used this very witty tone, as you might expect of an early New Yorker writer, and she she had this very kind of detailed description of clothing and the new collection, but she certainly did not shy away from criticizing the main designers of the era. Interestingly enough, another fashion critic, Elizabeth Host, and then became a designer, was also reporting for The New Yorker for Louise Long from Paris in this period under the pseudonym Parasite. So why then this lack of recognition, right? I believe that one of the main reasons is its association, as I said, with femininity from its very beginning. So the title of fashion critic, for instance, was not used in any of the newspapers here in the States until 1994, when it was coined for Emmy Spindler, which was then at the New York Times. However, fashion writings of fashion appeared quite regularly in newspapers, starting at least from the late 19th century, when Joseph Pulitzer, which was the publisher of the New York World, is credited with the development of the women's sections of newspaper. So this placement contributed to the field delays in legitimization. As this section, you see a couple of them here, are also known as the so-called women's pages, and often were the only places where women could develop journalistic careers, and were described certainly somewhat derisively as covering the 4 F's: food, fashion, family, and furnishings. And as you can imagine, they were dismissed as the epitome of soft news. So while these reasons for the delay in recognition are multiple, I would argue that the central one is the gender dynamic of the field, right? Its association with women and the feminine, which have been in turn historically associated with consumption, is central to this delay. Going back to both the history of fashion criticism and what's contained in the Anthology, the Anthology starts in the late 19th century, so it's temporally delimited, as well as being geographically delimited. It is during this period, in fact, that the fashion press was gradually expanded and democratized in Europe and North America. So Oscar Wilde's journalistic writing on fashion opened the Anthology and illustrates this proliferation of fashion writing across publication happening in this period of time. Wilde himself straddled high and low domains as he wrote about fashion for the Pall Mall Gazette, which was this wide circulation London-based newspaper akin to the yellow journalism, so a kind of mass journalism that was advanced at the same time here in the US by William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer himself. But Wilde also edited this higher-end monthly women's magazine, Women's World, from 1887 to 1889. You see in these slides one of the covers, and for it wrote quite, only edited, he wrote all the editorial letters, the editorial, and he was, the magazine could be said to have been a higher-end women's magazine, which was somewhat in line with the dress reform movement. So the Anthology also includes articles from niche and independent fashion style magazines, starting with this really interesting example called Rogue, which was an avant-garde little magazine from the 1910s, a pan of Vogue, of course, and it was published in the early teens. This issue is from July 1915. Generally speaking, the Anthology tends to favor or privileged work published in newspaper and general interest magazines, which are better able to provide unbiased criticism thanks to the relative distance from the industry. I think one of the reasons it is said that fashion criticism lagged behind other fields was because of the close connection between fashion and the fashion criticism and the fashion industry, the fashion press and the fashion industry. So hindering the ability of evaluating fashion critically. Here I'm showing you a couple more of the inside pages of this great little avant-garde data magazine called Data Influence, I should say, New York-based literary magazine called Rogue. I wanted to point out these columns by Louise Norton, which was one of the co-founder of the magazine. It was called Philosophical Fashions. It really was prescient in some of the themes it took on. It was described as a kind of as Wildean in tone and as giving a kind of tongue-in-cheek scholarly anatomy of fashion. But interestingly enough, it brings up important themes that will become important in later criticism, including unisex fashion. She also writes quite openly about women's lingerie and the women's body in a way that was certainly innovative for the period, which was the early teens. The illustrations are noted, and they're by Clara Tice. So the majority of the author anthologized tend to be, as I mentioned earlier, fashion journalists by trade, and they range from Wilde to more contemporary author like Givan or Vanessa Friedman, who is the current critic at the New York Times, the head critic at the New York Times, as well as people like Amy Spindler, who was the first, as I said, to receive the title of fashion critic in the US in a newspaper. Here are a couple of articles that Spindler wrote in the 1990s. But the collection also includes cultural critics who have written about fashion, which with some frequency, including Susan Sontag and Hilda Hulse. Their writings appear alongside authors who are best known as fiction writers such as the English novelist Angela Carter, the surrealist novelist Angela Carter, the recently rediscovered Los Angeles-based writer E. Babbitt, Babe Moore Campbell, who wrote about fashion and style in the 80s and 90s for Essence and Ebony, two pioneering African-American magazines. The anthology also includes a handful of examples of academic fashion theorists and historians writing in journalistic settings, thus highlighting the porous boundaries between media and academic discourses surrounding fashion. So I borrowed this term interwoven discourses by Agnès Rocamora, fashion theorist, who is actually French. But the anthology ultimately, I think, proves the point of the existence of a well-developed fashion media discourse, a type of discourse which Rocamora, who first coined the term, argues, although specific to the field of fashion, it interacts with a number of different discourses. As Rocamora argues, fashion discourse can be seen as, quote, made up of statements that extend beyond the confines of the field and belongs to various discursive formations. Fashion discourse overflows the limits of the field it unfolds in. So this ontology could be seen really as a mapping of these interwoven discourses across these aforementioned geographical and temporal boundaries, of course. So reading fashion criticism across a little more than a century, it became evident how fashion media discourse overlapped with particular insistence with the surrounding construction of gender, thus underscoring fashion's centrality to shifting gender roles. This can be noted as early as with the work by Oscar Wilde and Louis Norton, as I mentioned, as early as 1915, Norton writing in Rogue, invoked a unisex fashion. She proclaimed, for instance, that trousers and other things, this is a quote, I ought to be mere arbitrary symbols of sex, which I, for one, think obsolete. And this is, you can see on, I believe your left, the page from Rogue, in which she discusses this kind of unisex fashion, so to speak. Another interesting article discussing gender and what we would now call perhaps non-binary fashion is by Eugenia Shepherd in the early 60s, which Eugenia Shepherd was another fashion critic working for the New York Herald, in which she talks about the work of Rudy Gehrig and Elizabeth Hawes and their advocation for a miniskirt for men. So this discussion of fashion and gender, of course, increased by the end of the 1960s in response to the shifting of women's social roles. The 60s are, of course, a time of major cultural and social turmoils, but this is also the time when, within the history of fashion criticism, we see the women's pages, the so-called women's pages that cover the 4Fs, become to be transformed and renamed into what we know today as the style sections, which are, at least in theory, meant for any gender. And this is, of course, this change happened as a response to these major societal changes going on in the 60s. Particularly in the context of the United States, this is also the time that race begins to be discussed in conjunction with gender in fashion criticism in the mainstream press. This seems to have been partially spurred by the phenomenon of the Ebony Fashion Fair. The Ebony Fashion Fair, as many of you might know, is a traveling fashion show that was started by Eunice Johnson, a co-publisher of Ebony, which featured Black models wearing the latest fashion. Of course, this increased discussion of race in fashion writing can also be tied to greater societal changes and points to the important intersection between race and gender happening at this particular historical moment. Another notable event is that Essence, a fashion and beauty magazine directed to the Black American audience, women audience, was launched around this time, precisely in 1970. So this connection between discourses surrounding the role of women, femininity, and fashion, which transpires over and over in the writing anthologized in the book, I believe further underscores the extent to which fashion criticism was and still remains central to construction of femininity and masculinity. It played a central role in negotiating shifting gender roles and understanding of race. As Rocamora, again, after Foucault argues discourses are, quote, practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. Media discourses invest fashion, its product, practices, and agents with a variety of values whose truth is as much part of the object of discourse as the material reality it refers to, end quote. So one could argue that fashion criticism not only helped mediate the fashion ideals of the period, but to the extent to which it was constantly intertwined with discourses outside its field, it produced truths surrounding gender, race, and a host of other identity categories. So I believe this certainly discredits a kind of facile dismissal of fashion criticism as frivolous, which has taken place throughout history, but to the contrary, places it really in a central position within cultural criticism. So, fashion and politics. Fashion media discourse also frequently interacts with that of politics. The dress practices and appearances of politicians and their spouses are extensively discussed as early as certainly the 1950s. Here is an example by the fashion editor for the Washington Evening Star, Eleni Epstein, who wrote about the appearances and wardrobe choices of the Nixon and Kennedy White House during her time at this Washington newspaper. So this overlap between fashion and political discourse has certainly increased in the last two decades. And it can be observed perhaps more clearly in the work of Robin Given in the Washington Post. Here, Given, which is also based in Washington, of course, continued on Epstein's tradition of closely dissecting the clothing choices of those holding political power, while Vanessa Friedman, the New York Times, has extensively written about the centrality of clothing to politicians' message. And here I chose these two slides because that's a juxtaposition between an earlier discussion on I think those are presidential candidates' ties in the 60s and their meaning and their reception. And then, of course, a more contemporary one in 2016 of politicians' ties or lack thereof. So this greater intersection of fashion and political discourse can, of course, be attributed to the ever-increasing mediatization of politics and the centrality of image and appearances for politicians. As communication theorist Andreas Hepp explains, mediatization constitutes the molding force that the media exercises in areas well beyond its borders, such as politics. So these processes of mediatization in politics have undoubtedly accelerated with the advent of digital media, or where, as evident in the writing, for instance, of Epstein, it certainly predated them. So we can argue that a number of the critics collected in Anthology commented on the increased mediatization of the political sphere, while in this era of digital and social media, while certainly contributing through their reporting to this process. So fashion itself, from production to consumption, is constantly changing through processes of mediatization. These changes have affected fashion criticism in a number of ways and can be clearly observed in the ways critics cover the fashion shows and the importance materiality of clothes occupy in the reviews. As Rocamora argues, processes of mediatization have transformed the fashion show into a media event from the internet, for the internet, first for blogs and then social media, a fact which is self-evident to us now, especially after the COVID pandemic. This change into the fashion show being created for the media has affected the way the shows are covered, as their performative qualities are discussed at length alongside the actual garments. However, again, this progressive mediatization of the fashion industry predated the contemporary moment. As a New Yorker critic, Kennedy Fraser commented in the late 70s, quote, "With all the theatrical fanfare that launches collection these days, how is one supposed to assess the curious hybrid that is the dramatic new fashion show?" End quote. And here Kennedy Fraser was making reference perhaps most specifically to Alston, very performative fashion shows in the 70s. So this progressive lack of attention to the materiality of clothes in contemporary fashion criticism certainly can be connected to the progressive speed of fashion production, dissemination, and consumption. So these modes of circulation that are certainly ill-fitted to the extensive material analysis of clothes, which was the cornerstone of earlier criticism. If we read people like Lois Long or Eugenia Shepherd, respectively in the 20s or the 50s and 60s, the kind of detailed description of garments, the attention to the garment's details or the fabric origin was really central to criticizing the collections at the time, and this is certainly not the case anymore. However, pockets of resistance to this dematerialization of fashion exist in contemporary fashion criticism. Actually, this is a slightly earlier example that you see to the right. It's some detailed review by Bill Cunningham of the Martin Margiela collection in the late 80s, which he did for a niche fashion magazine, or independent fashion magazine called Details. For Details, he created, for instance, pages and pages of both detailed photographs of the garments, photographs of the shows which he took, as well as detailed reviews of the collection, which described the clothes quite closely. And whereas on your left, you see Guy Trebais, a style writer at the New York Times, experiment to review the menswear collections of that season, and the suits in particular, by wearing them in his daily routine. A surprisingly rare instance of embodied criticism. One perhaps could talk about his work as a form, about this kind of work in the contemporary time, as a form of slow fashion criticism, as I argue in the slides, which is in line to the phenomenon of slow fashion or slow living more generally. So finally, as the anthology moves into the 21st century, it mirrors the increasing transnational nature of the fashion industry, where the geography of fashions are constantly being renegotiated. As Paul Duguay writes, quote, "As the link between territory and culture becomes more tenuous, design becomes an increasingly global language, which practitioners in any given nation drawing upon a range of signifiers from all over the world in their work," end quote. We could argue a similar shift has occurred in the media, including the fashion media, which has become progressively deterritorialized, a process further precipitated by the global reach of digital media in the 21st century. Andrea Hepp, for instance, the media theorist, writes, communicative deterritorialization is related to the increased mediatization and globalization of media communication. Ever more media contents are available across diverse territories aimed at a transnational public, end quote. And here is perhaps counterintuitively an example of a transnational media product, which is a print product, right? We can easily imagine how digital media is transnational. In this case, Vesto is transnational, but it's a print product. It's as well as it has a website, of course, as everything does. It's produced in Paris, but connected to Britain and written English, etc. So to conclude, this anthology is really one of the possible tours and detours one can take in the rich and expanding field of fashion criticism. It is not meant to be exhaustive. What it is meant to be is a clear evidence of the richness, diversity, and long history of fashion criticism, providing a guided journey through some of the most compelling fashion writings produced over this past century. And with this, I conclude my talk. I am going to stop sharing screen. And yes, let me know if you have any questions.
First of all, thank you so much, Francesca, for this very interesting talk and overview over your book and the insight into this fascinating history of fashion criticism. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to start with a question, just something that you said at the end about the rich and expanding field of fashion criticism. If you could say something about how you view the field has changed in the light of digital media, and how is it expanding? Where do you see it going in a way?
Yes, I mean, another thing that I did not specify being a written anthology, it does, for instance, only anthologizes written media, right? I think with digital media and fashion criticism really became a multimedia practice. Of course, I felt the need to anthologize writing, primarily historical writing, as a way to kind of create an equivalent to the many anthologies of other forms of cultural criticism. But if I should, but in answer to your question, I would say that in the contemporary moment, fashion criticism has really become multimedia. It exists, of course, in the forms of podcasts, as well as in a hybrid kind of forms. But also, you could argue that it exists, for instance, on YouTube. There is budding fashion critics that use even a platform like TikTok as a mean to start out in fashion criticism. And that doesn't, it doesn't kind of confuse the existence of written fashion criticism, right? I think there's always a process also of remediation. Old media forms are taken in the new media form. But yeah, there is much more of a multimedia dimension to fashion criticism today than there used to be even just 20 years ago. So I see that's where the great expansion and change is happening.
Thank you. Thank you. I was also wondering, I mean, this anthology focuses on English language fashion criticism. And what about, you know, the sort of discoverably constructed fashion cultures like the French or Italian fashion culture and their fashion criticism, but also really, you know, fashion criticism in other languages and other fashion cultures other than the English?
Right. I think it's a baby. I mean, English is obviously not my first language. So it was an odd thing to anthologize fashion writings in English as a primary choice, but it was also a choice due to like the vast. I mean, we talked about opening it up and doing transnational fashion media, but it just wasn't possible in terms of costs as well as translation efforts. But I think I do think now fashion media has become so transnational, with the exception of certain places, of course, where there's a level of censorship. And I think a great example of the scope of transnational fashion media that is achieved through digital media is perhaps, you can find it in the discussion by Raina Lewis on modest fashion blogs and the way they really circulate globally. So I think that's certainly something that's happening. My book was ultimately also a little bit more historical. So I thought it was not really realistic to open it up to other language or other spaces outside of the US and the UK. But yeah, there's certainly a wide range of criticism being produced that's transnational in nature right now. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you. And then I wonder about the, let's say, loaded relationship between fashion criticism and fashion promotion.
Right. Yeah. So there has been in the literature on fashion criticism, there is a lot of discussion of that issue. The fashion press, the relation with the fashion industry has been traditionally very tight. So that could be seen as hindering a certain kind of negative criticism. And of course, according to some theorists, evaluation is the central component of criticism. So if you cannot evaluate negatively or positive, you cannot create criticism. That's a debated category. It's something that's primarily debated, I think, in art criticism. But I think that is why, with the exception of some pieces that are more like essays by Sontag and not Angela Carter, and Eve Babbitt, I shied away from including fashion writing from the mainstream fashion press, because I do recognize that there is this kind of tension there in the creation of negative criticism, right? The negative criticism in the mainstream fashion press usually happens by omission. So if something is not that great, it might be not discussed, but I think there is still not as clear demarcation between advertising and editorial that exists in other forms, in other kind of publications. And of course, this becomes an even more thorny question when you go into the digital media sphere, right? Which is in some way unregulated. So I think this question about authenticity and whether somebody's producing sponsored content or not, it's still something that's creates tension in this new mode of criticisms. But there's certainly people that are creating historically and contemporaneously, there's been a tradition of fashion criticism that was able to evaluate, right? So pass the test of real criticism, because it was always included in certain kind of publication that are not primarily fashion publication. It was certainly including newspaper, etc. So that possibility always existed, and that's why I think it was kind of strange to me that fashion criticism have been left by the wayside of so many of these institutions that legitimize criticism here in the US, and there seemed to be an obvious bias there.
Yeah, and you said that the bias is also determined by this sort of naturalized collection to with femininity, and possibly also commerciality.
Yeah.
That it seems to be sitting sort of at this uncomfortable position. But yeah, you've done this really incredible work of excavating in a way and bringing together these different fashion criticisms. So looking back, what do you think is the relationship between early fashion criticism and what seems to be really a culture of fashion criticism that emerged in the 19th century?
I mean, earlier than the 19th century, you mean, or earlier?
Yeah, so really, from, as I said, at the beginning, for example, Christine de Pizan, who could be, considered as maybe as a fast fashion critic, or a really early critic of fashion. How do you see this relationship between the 19th century fashion criticism, which seemed to be much more alive, but seems to also build on a tradition?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, in some ways, I think the 19th century, I think Christopher Brewer would argue, was this period of where the fashion press boomed thanks to technologies, right? It was cheaper to produce the fashion press, and the consumer as a category was greater. That's why it became not the consumer, but like basically the kind of cultural consumption also was booming in a certain way in these territories that I'm discussing in my book. And I think that is why I started at this period. And this is also the period where the women's pages were started in newspapers, specifically to just kind of capitalize on this consumption, and these kind of to try to get in a women's audience to read the newspaper and their advertising dollars that came with it. So at the same time, I feel like it could be, there has been a much longer lineage of fashion criticisms, right? So it's not just like film that, of course, as the medium itself, it's pretty recent. So its criticism is just, a little over 100 years old. So it's this long lineage of criticism, and it, as you said, it's kind of global. The French have a very robust tradition of fashion criticism, and Ulrich Lehmann had done quite a lot of work in the area. So I think that the farthest creates this puzzle in my mind. Why has it not been really discussed as much as other fields, also considering its kind of long history that you mentioned?
Thank you. There's
somebody put a
question coming in through the chat. Sarah asks, in writing your anthology, do you find that there has been a backward shift with fashion criticism from the democratization of fashion, potentially with the women's pages, into something that became gate-capped, highbrow, and exclusive to those in the industry? In other words, has it been more important to consumers the credentials and qualifications of who is writing critiques, or simply the accessibility to them?
So I'm not sure if, I think, in my opinion, the kind of there was, when we talk about written criticism, right? Some of its height, and in the 20th century, at least, certainly happened in around the period between the 70s and the 90s. And I'm not sure if I would see these critics, so those are primarily writers and journalists, as necessarily being the same as the gatekeeper that we traditionally associate with the fashion press. They're more like the editors. They tend to be the most important people, right, in a fashion magazine. They tend to be the people that are seated in the front row, and they tend not to really write. They're more tasked with putting together their editor-in-chief, or they're more tasked with what used to be the editorial, the fashion editorial component of the magazine. So fashion being this very visual language, I feel like the writers were always a little bit a step below. And I mean, and that might be another reason why fashion criticism was not taken seriously. Like the big figures, when we think about fashion press, are, the editor-in-chief, the Diana Freeland, etc. So perhaps that's also contributed to this omission of the writer. So yeah, I'm not sure if the fashion critic that I included in my anthology can really be considered gatekeepers to the industry. I think, although important, especially when it comes to perhaps critics for the New York Times, they were never as central to who, even in a time where the press really was very important. The press has, of course, lost a little bit of its shine in the 21st century with the advent of social media. But even when the press was really important, they were never as central to the making or breaking of a designer as the fashion editor would have been at fashion magazines.
Thank you. I think Sophie also has a question.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. Many years ago, I did my master dissertation on fashion, on journalists in the fashion press, fashion magazines, and so I try to understand this, the criticism in fashion, and I interview journalists in the fashion press, but also in the daily press, and it's very interesting how, so I interviewed journalists that have worked for the fashion press between the 50s and today, and it was very interesting to realize that the one who have started in the 50s, didn't have the feeling that they were that they can't really be free and open to criticize because of the luxury groups and all the advertising and sponsors. They say, because it has been a critique that fashion journalists were so, they were paid by the brand there, and so they were never able to critique or to have a critical approach of the collection of designer because of the fact that luxury groups and brands, luxury groups were funded all these fashion magazines and fashion journals. But it was, I think, and this is one of my questions, I have the impression when I interview those persons that during the 50s, 60s, 70s, before fashion became this business, this worldwide business, I don't know, the critics was easier because there were not this economic power of luxury groups. And journalists were not really aware of that. While after the 80s, 90s, the financiarization of fashion became so important that, in fact, they received so many gifts. And I remember some journalists saying, we received so many gifts. And they were working for Figaro and Le Monde. And they say, we can't be critical because we will lose our job. And it was really, they were really conscious of that. So do you think we can see an evolution of this awareness of lack of freedom or something like that?
That's so interesting. Yeah, I don't think, yeah, it's interesting that they spoke to you so openly about that. I mean, for instance, in the US, So if you work at a publication, it's like the New Yorker or any daily newspaper, you cannot receive gifts. I remember Gaiterbai telling me once that he lost his luggage and he was covering the collection in Florence. And, you know, Ferragamo was like, oh, you can get some of our clothes because he had no clothes. And it's like, no, I can't. I'd be fired from my job, right? So there's very strict rules in a few publications, but that's really not the case for the mainstream fashion press. But it's really interesting how you point out that, like, you know, there is that once you have huge conglomerates, the power is centralized. So, I mean, I think perhaps there is greater consequences if you criticize places that designers that belong to these conglomerates. I think at some level, there was always a pushback from designer about negative criticism. For instance, Balenciaga banned women wear daily for a really long time because they wrote really positively about Yves Saint Laurent. I don't remember who they wrote positively about him, and he felt they weren't giving him his due. So it wasn't even super negative, it was just submission again. So it did happen, but I think perhaps there was less this kind of power being in so few hands. So maybe there was a freer atmosphere, and there was also a lot less money in fashion, I think, prior to the multinational getting into the business. So it was a little bit more, you saw a lot more independent brands, if not.
Yeah, because I remember they explained me, sorry, they gave me a precise examples where, you know, after publication of an article, carrying this, or LVMH at the time decided to, you know, to cut the funding during 1, 2, or 3 months. And I have the impression that in France, or at least in Paris, it was recurrent. Like it was like the Le Monde and Le Figaro were really used to that too, because some journalists, you know, they were maybe more free and they wrote what they wanted, and the brands were, okay, you did that, so immediately we cut the funding. And yeah, they were really, I don't know. And I don't know, also at the time, at the end of the 20th century, when blogs developed, do you think that, you know, blogs and now social media, because it was presented as, okay, it's a new platform where people will be more free to critique, to be, but do you think that, you know, because blog have a little bit disappeared, replaced by social media, do you think that blogs were these new places of expression, or not really?
I mean, I feel like, there was a moment, and I feel like, again, where blogs did have this kind of novelty, and they were creating, there was a style of writing that was a little bit more intimate. There was almost a kind of diary, a vibe to some blogs, and they could do something more critical, perhaps also more original. But then again, they became very much the ones that did succeed and did stay. I think they became quite, not co-opted, I think they did it quite willfully. They became part of the fashion industry. I mean, in Italy, you think about somebody like Chiara Ferragni, she certainly is part of the industry now. I mean, I don't know if her blog was really ever critical per se, but she's a power player, so to speak. So there is this like co-optation. I feel like now perhaps some of the critical voices, at least here in the US, that are coming up. I mean, it happens a little bit in this new format called the newsletter. I don't know if it's something that's happening. And then in podcast, and again, there's this process. Will they be then become part of the kind of fashion industry? Will they stay independent? Because of course it's very hard to stay independent, especially if you're a small operation. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I do think there is sorry, go ahead.
No, you know, go ahead.
There is something a little bit specific to the fashion industry to really not be able to take criticism well. I mean, I couldn't imagine a book publisher pulling their advertising from a publication if they wrote negative criticism about a book, right? I mean, to have positive criticism, you have to have negative criticism. I think there's something specific about the fashion industry being not accepting of that reality.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We have a question from Olivia. Olivia, do you want to ask your... Thank you.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for being here. I wanted to ask you, so I've been reading about kind of like the shifts in communication with fashion, and for example, like Lush completely got rid of their social media platforms, and a lot of brands are searching for genuine influencers, they say, instead of like influencers who have like a lot of followers who can like really reach people. Instead, they're like looking for people who are like genuinely interested in their products and like have the same values as the brand and things like that. What do you see like in the future of fashion marketing or like the media in fashion and in terms of like critiquing and things like that?
I think that's a really interesting question. And yeah, it's you mentioned, which brand did you mention doing away with their Instagram? Was it Balenciaga?
It was Lush, but also I think Balenciaga like took off all of their posts and has been inactive, or it was one big brand. I forget, but I think it might have been Balenciaga.
Right. I think it's interesting, right? Because there is this super engagement with all media platforms, and then that all the brands do, and they have, of course, social media specialists working for them. But then there is also the other stance of like, okay, we're done. It's too much. I think an interesting kind of new media hybridization that fashion is doing. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but I think it's a really it's not criticism, but it kind of captures, I think, the contemporary moment is the way they are more and more working with video games and inputting their own products, so their own fashion within video games. So I think fashion is always trying to kind of enter new media territories. But yes, certainly I think people became aware of the fact that a lot of influencers were being paid. I think there was perhaps a generation that was not as aware of it when it just started, but now I think people are much more aware of these relationships.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for giving us this really very insightful overview and analysis of fashion criticism, and really for this important volume that I think starts to redress the omission and challenge some of the hierarchies that exist within criticism. And I think we all know how essential criticism is to development, because without it, we can't really, move forward in any way. So thank you very much for your interesting talk and for joining us today. And thank you all for joining and coming to the talk. Fashion Talks at AUP continues in the new year. In March, on the 9th of March, Ben Berry will be talking about social justice and fashion education, and he will join us online. And I hope you all have a healthy and joyful winter break and a good start to the new year. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you again to Francesca.